Rabbah for the parasha Shemot. And one of the things that we want to get into is the question, what was the importance of Joseph's death in this parasha versus the last one? And so as we get into these things, I just want to recap that last time we touched upon the cycle of Israel. And we basically kind of came to a conclusion that there seems to be some of the story missing here, and that Egypt plays a role both allegorically and mystically to our lives. And it needs to be understood that it is not the land of the Hebrews. It is not the land promised to Abraham. Remember, when Joseph talks to the man who had the dream, who was going to be restored to Pharaoh's service, he says, "It is not fair that I was taken from the land of the Hebrews." So we understand that Mitzrayim is not the land of the Hebrews. And there's some powerful stuff behind that we need to get into. But there are two deaths of Joseph. One is that physical expiration of his body, but another is the essence of Joseph. Let me explain. Throughout the system of covenant between Yahweh and Abraham and his descendants, there's been an "I will" in every instance, okay? In that instance, it says your descendants will be blessed. In that instance, it says that your descendants will be protected, they'll be provided for, they'll be in abundance. Those kind of all are there throughout the blessings, no matter what patriarch the blessing is occurring with. Jacob is the one that says, hey, if you feed me, if my family's okay, if I return to this land, then you will be my God. I will make this place a house of worship, and I will pay a tithe. It's interesting because what that did was that ratified the covenant between him and Yahweh. Whereas Abraham did not do that. Abraham said, well, how's this going to happen? I don't have any kids. And Isaac did not do that because Esau would have ended up with a blessing. He would have had to have ended up with a blessing. And the mystics teach, or the sages teach, the reason why Isaac says, may God do this for you, Jacob, is because he could not actually lay his hands on his sons and bless them, because he would have had to have blessed Esau, and that would have been basically calling good evil and calling evil good. I don't know if that's necessarily the direction I want to go with it, but it would have been a problem for the mystical condition of the earth. Okay, so where we need to go next is the concept that Joseph was a protection. Let me explain. When the famine came, there was a mechanism of provision activated for Jacob no matter what. When the famine came for Abraham, he went to Egypt. When the famine came for Abraham, he went to the Philistines. When the famine came for Jacob, there was a provision in Egypt, but that provision was very special in that it was his son. And Torah says, honor thy mother and father, that your days may be long in the land, right? And then Yeshua says, you elders have determined that even though that it says honor your mother and father, that if you have an inheritance that's appointed for your mother and father, but you give it to the temple, that it is korban. It is considered an offering and therefore is exempt from honor your mother and father. And he challenges that ruling, that particular judicial case law was inappropriate and infactual. So from that we can derive that honoring your mother and father is caring for your parents after you have stepped into a state of abundance. And that honoring your mother and father is taking care of your parents when they are older. Okay? It has nothing to do with obedience. It has nothing to do with, being 5 years old and yes, mommy and yes, daddy. It has to do with when you come into your inheritance that you care for your mother and father. Why would Yahweh have to instruct that? Because there was a sentiment that once I move out of the house, I don't got to deal with him anymore, right? So we can derive from that Joseph's provision of Jacob in the entire thing of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine was tied to taking care of Jacob. Literally a covenant protection upon Jacob. So the intrigue here, and this is important, is that Joseph created something for Jacob, whereas the rest of the people had to go sell their livestock, sell their land, sell their bodies in an indentured service to Pharaoh. Jacob did not. All of Jacob's children did not. Joseph did not. Goshen did not. Now, I can tell you, when they excavated Goshen, they found so many bodies. It was like a massacre had occurred there. They found bodies so cluttered and crowded that thing that is said in the wilderness, because there were no graves in Egypt, God brought us out here in the wilderness to die. There were no graves in Egypt. They had run out of places to bury the amount of people who died, not only in the plagues, but in the possession, the oppression. So this leads us to a very important point that is taught in Torah that is extremely important that you get into your mind when you begin the exploration of Torah. And is this: Torah never said in any of the things, like in Deuteronomy 28 or in any other area, that Yahweh would bring something upon the people, but instead seems to indicate that he would remove a protection as a matter of attraction. And what I mean by that is that the universe would respond to our desire to have a protection removed in honor of us, even to our detriment. You get the idea of the king or queen who is arrogant in their belief about their sovereignty, and so they invite a guest or somebody and they say, "You guards stay out there, I don't want you in here." And that person ends up being an assassin. The guards are obeying the king. The guards and the protection is staying within the confines of what they've been told to do. And so a violation of Torah is not about making God mad. You're serving the wrong God if you think that way about your God. Okay? But it's about removing a protection out of your life that is promised through covenant, and that which protects you honors your sovereignty in a jurisdictional sense. What I mean by that, when Yahweh said, "Let them have dominion over the earth," he meant it. And the earth, all of creation that is is going to be obedient to that instruction. So Joseph dies. But what's interesting is Joseph already died in the last parasha. Now Joseph dies in this parasha. Now, it should be noted that the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob indicates that the sons of Israel were in a state of covenant, but Jacob was not when he went to Egypt. Furthermore, there's an indication, and I don't mean that he wasn't in covenant, I meant that he was not in a state of covenant. And what I mean by that is you can be in covenant with Yahweh and be in a really bad way. You can. But the premise is that all the people who descended from Jacob were 70, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, it's interesting because the next one says, and Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. Now, in a normal American Protestant Christian reading of the English, there is definitely an indication that, okay, now that these guys were dead, all the influence that Joseph had went with him when he died. But truth be told is that's not how Egypt operated. Egypt had a political system with laws that could be enacted and could carry to the next pharaoh. Now, unlike the Medes and Persians where it was sealed forever, a pharaoh could definitely repeal those laws. But he had to have specific justification for it that would be a greater benefit to Egypt. So now we see where that modification occurs. But here's the crazy part about it. Were we dealing with a righteous, Torah-observant king of Israel when Pharaoh was in power, when Joseph was in power? No, we're not. He continues to be called Pharaoh, and there's no Nebuchadnezzar experience where he has to go eat grass and then declares to his entire kingdom that Yahweh's the God of Israel. Right? That Yahweh's the creator of the heavens and the earth. That doesn't occur. So we were still dealing with a king of the serpent, a servant of the serpent. We were still dealing with that wickedness, but Joseph was an anomaly to the process, and Joseph was a box positioned in a whole bunch of serpents that had a bunch of little kittens in it. And those serpents couldn't get to them because of the covenant and because of Torah. You need to remember that Torah was formed before any other thing in creation, and Torah was creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were created by Him and for Him, right? Okay, so in principle, as we process that information, we need to accept that Torah as a mechanism has been in operation this whole time, and Joseph is that protection. So before Joseph dies, these 70 and their descendants, whatever they may be, whatever the amount of children that Joseph had, somebody in that group formed a moral majority, as it were, formed some form of majority, and decided that they didn't like Joseph's policies and began to deviate outside of Joseph's policies. How do we know? Because Joseph died early. And we have all kinds of reasonings why we think that Joseph died early, but one that is for sure, one that can definitely ride, is that people no longer wanted him. Because truth be told is Joseph served a purpose, and it says that he was a Yeshua, that he brought Yeshua, he brought salvation. He brought salvation to a people, which means there were souls that had converted into the covenant with Yahweh, just like Abraham had made souls, just like Isaac had made souls, just like Jacob had made souls. So now there were these souls from Egypt who had moved out of the bindings and into the wrestlings, moved out of Egypt into Israel. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. As we go through this process of understanding that Pharaoh never abandoned his God, that Joseph protected the children of Israel from Pharaoh's God, and yet Joseph dies early, and therefore so does that protection. That begs the question, who asked for the protection to be removed? Now, there are theologians, there are people at some of the most prominent theological seminaries in the United States and in England who will tell you that so Yahweh's name could be made known. And I'm going to tell you right now, if that's the kind of God you want to serve, you probably shouldn't watch this channel. But if you understand that that's not the God you serve, either through life circumstances like myself, see, I can't say I serve that kind of God. I have been through things that would blow your mind where God has been faithful when I was totally unfaithful. Despite my desire to not want anything to do with him, despite my desire to not want any protections, I had them because I sort of Yahweh Rahum, the Lord of compassion. That's the first name he declares to Moses when he passes by him. So when I was in the Ne'um during our break, I found myself in a realization that Joseph existed purely for the sake of the protection of Jacob. Because Jacob was the last patriarch of the covenant promise. And the reason he was the last is because, unlike Abraham, who argued, it doesn't matter whether it was accounted to him for righteousness, because y'all don't even understand righteousness, right? Y'all don't even understand what accounting means, what calculating means. But what you should understand is that Abraham had 2 kids. One of them was not a part of the covenant. The second one was the covenant promise. And then he had kids after that, but it didn't matter. It was the child who came through Sarah who had the covenant promise. It was the child who came through Rebekah who was the secondborn, because the firstborn had some sort of thing going on that was not okay by the time we get to the blessing. Esau did not get the blessing. And heaven had decided that Isaac would not receive a blessing so that Esau would not have it. But Isaac was still in covenant. The promise was made to him. Through your descendants will I bless the earth. Right? Now we arrive at Jacob, and all of a sudden we've got a bunch of kids. And by the time he gets to Egypt, he's got 70 in all. So in principle, we can identify that means that Jacob was under the protection of Joseph until Joseph died, but somebody in Jacob wanted Joseph dead. Now, there is one documentary I watched, and I can't remember the name of it now, and I couldn't tell you what it is, that indicated that Joseph was poisoned. Now, I'm not going to push that, and I'm not going to believe that, but I'm going to add to the speculation that somebody wanted Joseph out of the picture, and it wasn't Pharaoh. Okay? Okay. So what that does for our identity is to remember that we are the ones who ask for the protections to be removed as a result of the infestation, where we start to want to compromise and go after other gods, who Deuteronomy 32 calls demons. Okay? Okay. All right. So now we'll jump back into our Midrash stuff. And we are at the question, did Pharaoh's decree of throwing all the boys into the Nile open the door for the death of the Egyptian firstborns? You know, there's a lot of people who use these stories as evidence for a prosecution of the king of the universe as being malevolent. And it's intriguing that we see choices of humans occurring first and then supernatural ramifications. You know, I've even heard a teaching, and I can't remember where. I think it might have been um, Curtis Taylor, who said that each of the Egyptian gods that the Egyptians worshipped were challenged in their jurisdiction. I don't know if it would have gone that deep with him. Were challenged, they were basically, each of the plagues flew in the face of that particular Egyptian god. And what I want to say is that people's choices in a state of utilizing a mechanism inappropriately definitely initiate karmic energy that will result in a need for some sort of tikkun or rectification. Now, a tikkun is a much higher level repair than a rectification. A rectification is a satisfaction of karmic energy through reciprocation. You steal a watch is stolen from you. But tikkun usually repairs generations of rifts, generations of tears in the karmic fabric. And so, where a firstborn dying within the same generation of the firstborn being killed, that's definitely reciprocal. That's in the same lifetime. And I would propose that that's probably true. I would propose that because you can identify that there would be a karmic consequence for throwing the firstborn into the river, that there would be a consequence for that other part. Now, when we start getting into the shedding of the blood of the Hebrew children in order to create medicines, because they didn't want to shed the blood of the Egyptians, and their water, their life sustenance turning to blood as a medicine, their water being a medicine, their water being a life-giving sustenance, turning into their medicine, there's a lot to be said there. That's definitely karmic energy. But again, happening in their lifetime, right? I'm sure we could find evidence of that throughout the plagues. But I want to remind you guys of something we discovered last year when we studied these parts. In fact, it was a very, very uncomfortable time in my life. And I can tell you the revelation that came through that uncomfortable time was extraordinarily about that concept of the people's hearts not really being attached to Yahweh. And him showing that he could make a distinction between plagues. In fact, we found ourselves somewhat questioning whether or not how we really felt about Yahweh after realizing that some of the plagues happened to the children of Israel. But then we finally discovered the cycle of Israel within this story and was like, oh, there it is. They're not so innocent here. Nobody ever said they're innocent. In fact, Yahweh told the children of Israel, I'm not sending you in the promised land because you're good. I'm sending you in the promised land because you're better than the people who are there. They're worse than you. Yeesh, that's crazy. Okay. I noticed that Torah gives us some tactics in fighting against oppressors. There is probably more than I see. The midwives distorting the truth, and I see Moses' mom doing malicious compliance. But I would caveat that it is with alignment and not disordered or chaotic. Totally agree. So I, you know, people get really hung up on "thou shall not bear false witness." And the difference between the word lie and the word false witness. Now, before I go any further, let me explain something. There is definitely a concept that you can override any commandment for the preservation of life, and you can override any commandment for the preservation of the temple, or at least what it represents. In other words, you can override commandment for the sake of the execution of ministry, like working on the Sabbath, right? Okay, so the premise is, and I think there's probably an exception to the temple one, but the premise is that basically what I want to get at is that deception, right? Where she puts she's obedient to Pharaoh. He said throw the babies into the Nile, but she throws them in a basket. She puts it in a position where Pharaoh's daughter's going to come down and be by the river, and boom, she finds the baby. She tells his sister, right, to what? To watch and wait. Now remember who this is. This is the prophetess of Israel. This is Miriam, right? Positioning herself in such a way as to make sure that Jochebed becomes the nursemaid of the baby. It could have went a little weird, right? They could have said, oh my gosh, it's one of the Hebrew babies, and flipped the basket over. But she didn't. She knew which daughter to put the basket of reeds near, and which daughter did what. So yeah, there's some subversion there. Absolutely, I agree with that. But then also the midwives saying, the Hebrew women, they're strong and they give birth quickly. So we never get there in time, and we know that that wasn't true. We know that the Hebrew midwives definitely were present to deliver the babies. But again, it was that falsehood to preserve life. Should we rely upon falsehood without purpose, or should we rely upon falsehood without the light? I think that I would caution you there. That falsehood upon falsehood upon falsehood upon falsehood is the outcome because of reciprocation. But there seems to be an exception made. David does it. A number of people do it. But the premise seems to always be the preservation of life. I agree, though. None of it is disordered or chaotic. It's methodical, well thought out. And I'm going to propose something very important here. We have an ignorance to the fact of what happens before we come to the earth. However, some extra biblical writings and some subtle biblical writings indicating that we are present at the intention for us to come here. You say, now wait a minute, isn't it that when we're born, our soul goes into our body, and that's like the first time that it happens, and then because it's appointed for man to die once, and then comes the judgment. I want you to understand it's appointed for man to die once in his lifetime, and then comes the judgment. If you haven't grasped the idea that there is reward and consequence after death, and that reward and consequence is directly tied into human training, then you got to kind of recalibrate your brain and accept that there was a past you who came up with a plan, because nobody's going to be allowed to come here and just be a bum, right? Comes up with a plan and a purpose for some sort of rectification or tikkun, and within that process, some sort of elevation, and those plans have to do with purpose. If you don't have an understanding of purpose, if you don't have an understanding of your personal legend or your personal vision, You definitely need to get your mind wrapped around that reality before you really start to step into love your neighbor as yourself. Because part of loving yourself is stepping into that purpose. In fact, there's actually a mechanism built into you that is the mechanism of jealousy. Do you guys know? And let me say something real quick. There's no mention of God being jealous in the Bible. Okay? That's your English Bible. The word jealousy itself, as a concept of envy, it has to do with covetousness. It has to do with that premise of trying to make a determination whether somebody should have the blessing that they have because you want it, is actually a mechanism letting you know that you're not walking in your purpose, that you're not walking in your fullest potential. So you begin to actualize that, and the things that were coming this close to your body, this close to your face, your friend has the car you want, is because of the concept of not walking in the wholeness of your purpose. So the reason this is important is because when we look at this in terms of a child being born and their soul coming to earth, there's a purpose behind it that has to do with an agreement as to what you will do as a child to be trained by your parents for your purpose. Now I'm going to tell you, if you don't believe this or you don't like it, I don't care. I believe it. I like it, and it has changed my whole entire outlook on life because I realized that the horrible hell of a childhood I had was training for my purpose. Now, having said that, I think it's important to understand that within that context then, Yocheved knows that Moses is special. Our parents are always told that we're special. My dad, who was extraordinarily dysfunctional in addiction and in his lack of purpose and in his lack of connection to his soul, holds me up to heaven and declares that God had given him a son and that there was something special about that son. And now, here I am trying my best anyways, to what? To give you guys something so powerful and so different that you stop being a sheeple in American Protestant Christianity. And in that process, hopefully become the change that this world needs. So, I believe that Yocheved knew that Moses was one who needed to be preserved. If there was a karmic response, Yehoshua writes that there was a karmic response of the firstborns. The premise is if there was a karmic response that the firstborns died because the Hebrew children died, then guess what the cowardly Hebrews and the cowardly people were doing? Throwing children into the Nile. Especially because what happens with Pharaoh's daughter? She says, oh yeah, that's got to be one of the Hebrew children. Because why? Because they were being thrown into the Nile. Now, in that process, we also definitely need to look at the parallelism between Herod's behavior with the time that Yeshua was born and Moses' time, in that Pharaoh had somehow deduced through divination that a Messiah had been born. And that was part of his fear. Little did he know he raised Messiah in his household, as did what happened with David and Saul, where Saul was actually preparing David to become king, bringing him into the household, adopting him, having him marry one of his daughters, having the two people who should ascend to the throne die, and therefore David become king by default. That is a mechanism of purpose. So Pharaoh raises Moses as a result of the fact that Moses needed very specific purpose training. What will really blow your mind is when you understand that Pharaoh had to be disconnected from his soul to not know that he had agreed to be his father, that he had agreed to raise him and his household. Okay, so in all of that stuff, we move into the thought that there are definitely trainings within this parasha that are very, very important, and if overlooked, not understood. Okay? All right. Now, next, we're going to look at the question, was Reuel and Yitro, or Jethro, the same person? You know, there is actually a lot of rabbis who, there are a lot of rabbis who basically have touched upon this. And one of the sentiments that seems to be present throughout their commentary, I think we're talking about probably Ibn Ezra, Rashi, Maimonides, all of them had something to say about this. And the general consensus is that there was no way for Jethro to give advice to Moses in chapter 18 of Exodus that Yahweh would say his advice is good unless he was a priest of Yahweh and not of Midian. Meaning Jethro had a conversion. Now, they say that Jethro's conversion was the result of, I want to say it was Balaam, but I don't think that's right. No. Jethro had a conversion because of something to do with something that happened with Jacob, and I can't remember what, and it's totally irrelevant, because really what the question is why does he have two different names, and that's it. When he enters into covenant with Yahweh, instead of being a priest of a false god, he becomes a priest of the Lord, and therefore he ends up being under the order of Melchizedek and has a new name appointed to him. Beyond that, Alan, I don't know that there's necessarily a whole lot of commentary, except that, again, we're dealing with two different names, right? Jacob and Israel, Pharaoh and king, Reuel and Jethro, but also Yahweh versus El Shaddai, Yahweh versus Ehya, Yahweh versus Adonai, right? Okay. So the next one, okay, so the next one is basically going to be about timing. Now, basically what it says is, with regard to the question about Joseph and Moses and their connection, or what did they have in common, that there also needed to be understood that they were actually very timely in their existence. And here's the part that's interesting. Bottom line is that in the process of purpose, will be timing. And it's interesting because one of the things that I want you to think about is what is the single most only denial of prayer that ever exists. We will argue about this depending on who you are, that God says no to prayers, but he does not, because your desire that brought about the prayer in the first place is actually from him. And it's a matter of you distorting it in your mind that causes it to turn into something wicked, where it's a violation of Torah. Okay? Case in point would be David's incident with Bathsheba. He didn't follow Torah as his mechanism or his filter, but if he was not supposed to have Bathsheba as part of some grander plan, and of all people, Solomon being born of her, it would have not stood. She and the baby would have died, right? Because that's what Torah demands in an adulterous relationship. But when you get into the concept of purpose, and you get into the concept of a soul, and you get into a concept of connection, things change significantly in how you look at things. So it's interesting that the delay of something is the only thing that actually exists within the affirmative action. Maybe that's not the best word. The affirmation and then action taken to confirm a affirmation within covenant. And what I mean by that is he says yes, but not yet. And that not yet is a delay because of a timing of something that we don't necessarily understand. Did Joseph need to go to Egypt and begin training in stewardship? Yes. Did Jacob know that? It seems he did. Did Joseph know that? It seems he did. Because remember, Jacob saw his generations at the ladder, right? Joseph saw his generations in the dreams. They had to have known location. They had to have known that it must have been Egypt. Joseph was to train in stewardship in Egypt for that moment when he would go before Pharaoh and preserve the land for the sake of Jacob and his descendants, who would become very great during that time. Okay? Next, and this is important, Moses is born after the crying out. Joseph is of age to become a steward of Egypt at age 30. Moses is of age to become a steward of the Hebrews at age 40. However, there was still something that needed to occur. We don't know what that something was, but we do know that between the time of the crying out and Moses is being born and raised in Pharaoh's household, oppression was getting worse. Possession was getting worse. Okay? So then we get into this concept of the crying out, and that being the time when Moses is brought back to Egypt and has begun to become the Messiah of the people, to move the people out of Egypt, out of the bindings, out of the system, into the new system, going from the bindings to the wrestlings, right? Okay. So that is an important point, that timing was something that both Joseph and Moses had in common. I agree. For such a time as this, as people use that terminology a lot to indicate that timing has purpose, right? So looking at that, looks like that is actually the last question. And a point is being made here in the Midrash. It's a long one, so I'm gonna try to scrunch it up, and I may not be able to do that. But Egypt forms discernment through concealment before Torah, and judges enforces accountability after Torah. And Ezekiel ensures that formation is never mistaken for permission once revelation has occurred. Egypt is not a warning about what happens when Israel sins, it's a warning about what can happen to identity under prolonged domination. Judges a warning about what happens when identity is freely betrayed. Ezekiel bridges the two by reminding later responsible people that what was once nearly lost under concealment must never again be surrendered after revelation. Well, that's deep. It's an interesting thought. Okay, so I think the gist of it, and just so you guys know, it's a argument that Israel was not under blatant idolatry, and I'm gonna probably say that there had to be some sort of selling. There had to be some sort of possession, and that I would lean in the direction of saying that just like what happened where Joseph dies early, and just like what happened where it's Jacob that goes to Egypt and not Israel, but the sons of Israel go to Egypt, that there's still a hint of disconnection from covenant in the Egyptian occupation. Let me see if I can build on it a little bit, because I really like what's said here, and I wanna definitely not just dismiss that. First of all, we need to look at Psalm 37, because Psalm 37 is that identity thing, right? So I'm just going to go in here to Psalm 37 and read a portion of it. And let's see. I'm tempted to use the NASB here. Just let me look really quick at something though. And again, when we get a video changer, and I can actually video change these cameras, I'll be able to share these verses again. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read out of the NASB 2.0. A Psalm of David. Do not get upset because of evildoers. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, For they will wither quickly like the grass and decay like the green plants. Trust in Yahweh and do good. Live in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in Yahweh, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to Yahweh and trust also in him, and he will do it. He will bring out your righteousness as the light and your judgment as the noonday. Rest in Yahweh and wait patiently for him. Do not get upset because of one who is successful in his way, because of the person who carries out wicked schemes. Cease from anger and abandon wrath. Do not get upset. It only leads to evil doing. For evildoers will be eliminated, but those who wait for Yahweh will inherit the land. Now, it's interesting. There's a number of things we can get into here, but I want to just read this a little bit different. Do not get upset because of Egyptians. Do not be envious of oppressive Hebrews, for they will wither quickly like grass and decay like green plants. Trust in the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, and the God of Abraham, and do good. Live in the land and cultivate faithfulness, right? Or feed off of faithfulness. Delight yourself in Yahweh, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to Yahweh and trust also in him, and he will do it. Now, I'm not going to go any further than that. But what I want to say here is that in the losing of identity, you experience that through an enticement away from your identity. Something has to seem better. That's just how our minds work. Your mind does not work. I'm gonna say this, and then I want it to really sink in. Your mind never works off of things that don't work. Your mind never works off of things that are ineffective. Your mind never works off of things that are inefficient. There has to be a payoff. There has to be a neuropeptidic registry of memory that this thing worked somehow. Now, where this becomes really imperative is in the concept that you won't deviate from your identity unless something seems to work. Something seems better. And that's where I say there had to have been some sort of infestation. Now, having said that, though, it's really interesting that there's kind of this concept of there being a before Torah is revealed, and so while Torah is concealed, versus after Torah is revealed, differential created between Judges and Egypt. Number one, I'm going to say, the Torah written on the hearts had to be renewed in the new covenant, meaning originally it was written on the hearts of people, and that's how we know that Abraham kept God's commandments perfectly. He kept all of Torah perfectly. Most of the rabbis will say that's because Yahweh taught him Torah. But the premise is that the concealment of Torah, I like that, the concealment of Torah or the non-revealing of Torah would be definitely something that people would have to be connected with their heart in order for that to occur. Now, what's intriguing is that really there's kind of almost an indication within that statement about domination, that domination can eventually condition one to believe differently about their identity. I totally agree with that. If you tell a child long enough that they are a specific thing, they will grow up and be that thing. That's why you have to be very cautious about how you raise a child in Torah. So, in principle, I think one of the things that I want to dive into with this idea would be one of basically saying, you know what, I agree on one part and I disagree on the other. I do believe that part of a deviation from an identity has to be the result of enticement. However, the idea of there being a full out deviation from the covenant of Yahweh in terms of them being completely, like I said, there had to be a selling. And in my reconciliation to that is simply the filters that I carry with me about God, right? About how he operates and what he does. Yes, I get that concept of concealment, and that I like that because there's almost this idea that as long as they had stayed connected to their the Torah written on their heart, they would have stayed within the protection, which would have created a very intriguing outcome between Israel and Goshen and Egypt during this season of Moses, right? It would have been a very different outcome. Let me see, because I've got some notifications here. Let me see what else we got going on. Interesting. So it's interesting because the concept that is being brought forward is the idea that there was purpose behind the oppression beyond just the the deviation from covenant. All I'm going to say is that if Joseph and Jacob would have done what they were supposed to do, in other words, if they would have gotten Joseph to Egypt and he would have gone into a state of stewardship, he would have not had to go to prison. And I'm not saying that that deviation was punishment, nor am I saying that deviation was chastisement. I'm saying that deviation was force. And what I mean by that is that Yahweh and the soul connect before birth in a agreement of purpose and plan. And then the soul and Yahweh diverge, so that the soul does not remember that meeting, and furthermore, the soul becomes sovereign, and the soul becomes, moves into a state of dominion, and within that state of dominion, there is a context of forgetting, as it were. Then there is a convergence again in that lifetime of that purpose in those moments. As that soul moves back into that convergence, that's where that co-authorship occurs. Now, where we see that happen is in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, where Adam's soul is formed first, and the plan of creation is activated. Dominion, subduing, replenishing, all of the things that would occur with Adam, and then he's formed out of the dust of the ground. Now, one of the statements that's said is, did Joseph go to prison due to sin or because he had to be formed? Totally agree. The forming needed to occur, but there needed to be a return to the plan. There needed to be a convergence upon the purpose, upon the plan. And when there's a divergence and there is a delay, the plan doesn't change. Same thing with Bathsheba, same thing with Joseph, same thing with, and really the wisdom behind this is deep, because that means that the Exodus had to occur. Joseph said, "You're taking my bones to the promised land with you." But there's never an indication that they had to go through what they're going through. Now, I know that there probably will be a reference to the discussion between Abraham and Yahweh when he says, "Your descendants will go in and will go through this thing." But what I'm trying to put out there is, I really do believe, whether it be as a result of bitterness, which is possible, or it be as a result of a hardening of the heart, which is possible, it didn't have to be this way for Egypt. It didn't have to result in a judgment. And it didn't have to result in the people going through what the people went through. Remember, some of the plagues went upon the people, which was an indication of some sort of of um, some sort of process of a catalyst for change, right? And so that's why I say there had to have been some sort of deviation. There had to have been some sort of choice made. I do lean in the direction that somebody really wanted Joseph out of the scene and that it was not Egyptians. And I also lean in the direction that there was some form of idolatry. I will definitely concede, though, that it didn't have to necessarily go this direction, because there was still purpose and there was still a potential for forming. I will jive with that. That there needed to be formation through what was going on with the nation of Israel. But one of the areas where I I want to say that Yahweh says, "I didn't bring you out of Egypt because you were a great people or because you were a good people. I brought you out of Egypt because of my covenant. I brought you out of Egypt because I said that I would," right? Um, and that covenant goes back to Abraham. So in Deuteronomy, it flat out says, "You don't think you merited this," right? So I guess we could potentially get into a context of, I was seeing if there was anything else that you wrote. I guess we could get into, oh, there it goes. Um, I guess we could get into the concept of, oh man, what was I going to say? Okay, so we could get into the idea that there is calamity that falls upon someone if they are in a state of meritlessness that serves a purpose beyond their own life. Can definitely get into that idea for sure. And I think what's important, and this is true in terms of the, not only in terms of the concept of the cycle of Israel superseding the revelation of Torah, but also a principle of there being a the principle of there being a meritlessness versus a merited uh, perception, right? We know that Adam's perception of the tree of life became the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because there's one tree, there's not two. We know that there were two different gardens. One garden was the garden of God, one garden was the garden of Eden. And we know also that there was a concept that within that construct, it was about merit, it was about earning, it was about rewarding consequence instead of just simple meritlessness and positioning. It's an interesting concept, and I would say that what I will agree with is if the Israelites were in a unmerited state, that is true. But if they were in a merited state, in other words, they themselves were in a state of whether they were good or whether they were evil, whether the Egyptians were good or whether the Egyptians were evil, then I would lean more into the cycle of Israel. Let's see what we got here. Interesting. So it's interesting because within that concept, we just definitely have the need for formation. I agree with that. I agree that there is that essence of Adam, and then the formation of Adam is when purpose finally comes, because he goes from being a soul to being this thing formed out of the dust of the ground. And what's interesting is when we look at the instances, this is something from the Genesis in the image of God, that it seems as though there was a refusal there was like a refusal from creation to operate without the Adam present. And that was because he had already subjected it to Adam, right? So it was a refusal of creation to operate. That's where the idea that things had not yet grown and all that other stuff, even though that they were told to grow. And then all of a sudden, Yahweh brings the animals to Adam, and now there is collaboration. Now there is a connection between Adam and Yahweh within the soul of Adam as a nefesh, as a living being, right? And so, a nefesh chayeh. And so then, in principle, we know that that formation is what gives purpose. So I would actually agree with that idea. I just lean in the direction. And two of the biggest reasons I do is because of their response to Moses. That's number one. When Pharaoh says, no straw, they don't respond in a military manner. They respond in a manner that would be more along the lines of, say, somebody who was in a state of victimhood. Now, bear with me on this, because the truth be told is that they continue this behavior all the way into the wilderness. And it's indicative of somebody who's caught up in idolatry and has just been along for the ride on the deliverance, right? They're so quick to form the golden calf when things change. So that's where I would challenge that on that Midrash. But the formation part, totally agree with. How they would have moved into that formation, that I think is contingent upon how much they actually fell into idolatry or not. I definitely want to preserve the sanctity of the soul of the children of Jacob. I do. And I definitely want to honor that they were high-level mystics, right? I want to say that I think Jacob taught more to Joseph about what he learned from Shem than anybody else. But that doesn't mean that Reuben or Judah or Simeon or any of those guys were not operating in some sort of tikkun, rectification, elevation, right? A revealing of the light. But their response to Moses, response to the all of the things, I mean, the only thing they really did right was put blood on the doorposts. And the only thing that actually went in front of them as a process of proof that they were within some form of meritless entitling was the fact that up until they decided not to go into the promised land, Yahweh tolerated their testings. Yahweh tolerated their stuff. And what I mean by that is not that he was being tested and it was making him angry and he was being patient. Those are human things. We're talking about an energy being with absolute superiority in knowledge, in foresight, in mathematics, in probability calculation, etc. The dude knew long before they did the things that they did that that's what was going on. So when it says he tolerated it, or that these 10 times you've tested me, it is important to understand that that has nothing to do with the human's concept of patience or the human's concept of long suffering, but instead would move in the direction of saying that he over and over and over again ignored their request to remove the protections and ignored it for their sakes. But when they finally refused to accept the protections of the promise itself is when things went left. Let me see what else we have here. Yeah, and see, that is one thing. So one of the things that it was said is that it's not about operating in merit or in sinning, but about carrying out their purpose, not moving toward their desires, not acting and moving in the light. I totally agree. That. Okay, so here's how I would put this. There was a pattern present in the people after the plagues that appears to be the pattern that was present in the people before the plagues, that is indicative of a people who's in a state of disconnect from the light. That seems to have come through a merited action, which could be idolatry. But I love this discussion. Let's keep going. Yes, I totally agree. That is what they consistently failed at. I totally agree. And just so you know, there will come a time when we will be able to bring people on stage and we can have these type of discussions and work it out. Yeah, so it says, right, I am saying it is because it was beaten out of them. And all I want to say here is that I don't buy into the conventional story. But I will say that bitterness is definitely a mechanism of darkness. So if we go with that they never actually activated idolatry, but they did remove the protections for some other reason, I can jive with that. But the premise is that the behavior reflects a darkness that's beyond just being bitter about their situation. So that, I think, is important. Now, I would agree with you on this. I'm just going to go out there and say this. You oppress a people or you treat a certain people that way for long enough, they will begin to believe something different about themselves. And all of a sudden you take them out of that and they will live that identity within the confines of the new location that you bring them to. That's simple kidnapping psychology right there. So I can jive with that. One of my biggest things that I deal with in this is the level of genocide and the level of suppression, the level of I can't think of a word to describe how brought down they were, but let's say the level of humility that is occurring here appears to be more operating from a collective conscious soul that is in merit than one that is not in merit. Let's see what we got. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So can we kind of glean from both of these midrash opinions? And just so you guys know, if you ever saw two rabbis midrash at a yeshiva, you would think they were going to kill each other. And so this has been a very benign discussion in regard to a midrash, but the the premise, I think, um, that's important here is we began this journey discussing the loss of identity. Now, there may be a disagreement about how that identity was lost. I'll allow for that. What is an important point that needs to be brought forward, and that is contained in the name of the parasha, is that a name is an identity. And if that identity is merited, that identity will operate within the confines of good and evil, and therefore the realm of death, and therefore never actually meet the quota of provision, protection, and instruction. Will always fall a little bit short. But when we operate within the realm of life and in an unmerited identity, then we operate within the confines of abundance through purpose, spiritual eliteness like revelation, through purpose, not because you're a good person or a bad person, right? And all of a sudden, the scarcity changes to abundance, the lack and decrease changes to increase and abundance, right? Because all of a sudden, we remember where our provision, protection, and instruction come from. We remember that our identity is not merited through our good and evil, but through He made Him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. A remembrance of identity needs to be maintained through rhythm. One of the things Yehoshua is proposing here is that the rhythm was actually reversed. He's proposing that it was the ongoing rhythmic disidentity that actually created the process by which Israel would go through what they went through. It's an interesting thought. And I can tell you, again, like I said, I cannot necessarily jive with the conventional story. There's a number of reasons I can't, but I can tell you that that's been years and years of research and study. What I can tell you is that there is definitely a loss of identity within this season, within this parasha, within this book of Exodus. In fact, if you study the ramifications of the golden calf in its entirety, you will understand that humanity actually is in a little bit worse state than they were before the golden calf. So I think that's really important as we say, okay, you know what? disagree about how, but we still agree on the effect. We disagree on the cause, but we agree on the effect. And I think that's important here. I do believe that formation plays a huge role in purpose, in walking in the light, in being in the light. So, you have anything you want to share?
No.
No? Okay. Anybody else want to comment before we end? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. We will work on being on people being able to be on, um, so that we can have these discussions a little bit different. But for right now, in the interim, we're live on YouTube as the only broadcast. We're not doing the Zoom right now, and we are live on YouTube without the amount of subscribers that we would need to bring somebody on stage. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about being on. Anyways, um, I think one of the biggest things that we can take away from this today is it was never intended that Adam would receive the light and deliver the light to others through whether he was good or bad. It was never intended for him to understand his identity in that way. Furthermore, it was never intended for the serpent to be anything other than an indicator of what we needed to listen to in order to A, check whether it's true, and B, decide it's not true and ask what then is actually true. So the whole idea behind the serpent, behind the ego, behind Hasatan, behind Satan, is to get you to examine and make sure that the accusations are not true. If they are, you just make a course adjustment. That's it. That's all. You can bank upon the merit of the Messiah to make that course adjustment. Joseph delivered a wicked people, the people of the serpent. Joseph did not deliver people in covenant with Yahweh. He became a Yeshua, salvation, to the nation that would eventually oppress his children. And don't think he didn't know that. Don't think he didn't know that. He knew purpose in ways that we would not understand purpose. So it was never intended for man to determine his position of rulership upon this earth through whether he was good or bad. People's opinion, reward and punishment. I like that. Okay, so one of the things that Yehoshua says, he says, even when they were beaten down at their lowest stripped identity, God chose them. There's an interesting concept there, and that is that just because we disassociate from our identity doesn't mean that Yahweh does. And Yeah. I can, you know what? I can jive with that. He says, if they're an elite fighting force, then we're just dealing with a rebellion. I'm not saying they weren't ever one. I think they were one and became one again. That's very possible. It is very possible that the oppression and suppression that came into that instance and in that process of them serving
That makes total sense.
as an elite force was not dumbing down, but was suppressed through that oppression itself.
Yeah,
That makes total sense.
That makes total sense. Their
Mm-hmm.
original identity would have been an elite military force, and then we see them become that again. So they were that statement in itself proves that they were disconnected from who they were and their identity.
Yeah, that's deep. The concept that, because I will return to I want to make something clear here. Within the confines of infestation, oppression, and possession, you need to understand that part of what will happen is a there will be a point where the suggestion becomes the actual belief, and the belief will actually become the action. It is not what you do that makes you who you are. Never. You don't steal something and then you're a thief. You have to believe you're a thief in order to steal. And so the premise is that could definitely result in it not being idolatry, but it's still resulting in possession at the point in time that there is actually a demonic command to sacrifice innocence. That will result every single time. You will find it throughout the Bible that when a nation takes possession of Israel, there will always be a demonic command to sacrifice innocents, because there's already a demonic command to sacrifice innocents. Egypt, okay, when Joseph went down to Egypt, let's make no mistake, when Joseph went down to Egypt, it's not like Pharaoh was in a state of righteous actions, as it were. He wasn't in a state of wanting to be in the light or any of those type of things. Pharaoh was a pharaoh, and his magicians, or chasdim, his Chaldeans, were part of that process. And we know that those same magicians and Chaldeans operated in contrary to Moses the Elohim and Aharon Hanavi, or Moses the God and Aaron his prophet. So there is something interesting here in that they would be reduced in their capacity and purpose through that wearing down that we talked about in the beginning of this thing. That would have been the oppression, to a actual offering self. Because short version, you lose your identity, you are going to eventually arrive at disintegration, and you're going to eventually arrive at darkness, in darkness, right? Let's see what else we got. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's there's a concept that this doesn't take a long time, and that's kind of what's being mentioned here. A, you can lose identity quickly, And you know what? I will totally agree with that. I actually can testify that that's true within my own life. That the times when I have lost sight of my identity, and I've lost sight of, and I've disconnected from my soul, and thereby disconnected from heaven, I have definitely done that in a short amount of time.
Yeah, that doesn't take much, right? All it takes is fear.
Well, and here's the interesting thing. I'm going to throw one other huge thing out here. I'm going to throw out here that this is the beauty. This is the beauty of Midrash, but I'm going to take it a step further and say this is the beauty of what happened to Israel. Here's what I want you to think about, okay? Let me gather my thoughts here. So, the principle is that all that we understand about physics and reality were in violation. And when I say in violation, what I mean is they were not being obeyed, and truth is they just didn't exist at Mount Sinai, which was the revelation of Torah. I totally agree with that, Josh. I agree that that was a revelation of Torah, but I'm going to propose to you that it was the revelation of Torah to the nations and not to Israel itself. In other words, that it was written for us and not for them. But the premise, and this is important, is that the mountain was on fire, upside down, people were under it, which is either indicative that they were in a cave or that it was hovering above them. It was completely off in that people saw sounds and heard sight. When you read the Hebrew, you go, what is happening here? Right? It's different. It's way different. And there are voices and there are things going on to the extent that the people realize that they are transcending any reality they've ever encountered. What better people to experience this than ones cast down that much? So I will agree with that part for sure. I will agree. It doesn't take long to lose your identity, and there is definitely, just as much as there's a concept, and you know this, Yehoshua, there is a concept of rhythmic maintenance within the maintaining of the connection of the soul. There's got to be a rhythmic differential. So well, I mean, even the rabbis teach that before Torah was written down, the nations would not have known it because it was written on the heart of those in covenant. You know, and let's just go with one other thing here, and that is, I mean, you guys have no idea how many times purpose has just slapped me in the face. I will be struggling with something. Anger, that's a big one, right? This is a Q problem, is anger. And somebody will come to me and say, brother, I really need your help. I am tired of being angry. And I feel like saying, you know, I ain't the guy for that. I'm not the one. But I don't. And the reason I don't is because I believe, and I've believed this for a long time, that when someone comes to me, that's my vessel. That is the greater needs to pour into the lesser, and it really doesn't matter what the greater feels about the situation. Moses did not want to be Moshiach. He didn't want to be an Elohim to Pharaoh. He didn't want to be a god to Pharaoh. He wanted to just shepherd flocks and call it good and die in the wilderness. It was fine with him. So it is interesting because there is almost a concept that the loss of identity is actually, because we were kind of discussing here in the chat, that it's possible that Torah was concealed from the nations in Israel and that they didn't share it because of, their own ego. But I'm going to throw something out there that maybe the loss of identity concealed Torah. See where that goes. So we are well beyond the Shabbat, and the sun has gone down, and so we are definitely have begun the new counting of the Torah. I would just like to, acknowledge and give thanks and show gratitude for the fact that we have a congregation who has the belief that they can contradict something that I say, or even correct me in the comments or whatever, and that from the beginning I've said I'm training my replacements, and one of the beauties of that is that they will all be better than me in this. But what's really where I want to show some gratitude is in the fact that we have people actually participating in Slack while they're watching the YouTube. You guys have adapted to the changes that have been made, and I'm really grateful for that. And I just want to acknowledge you guys in that. Yeah, what a beautiful lesson to feel helpless on Shabbat. Mm-hmm. Uh, yeah. So there's a kind of a mention in there. What I just showed gratitude for is what he was actually stating, or what he was typing at that moment. I had just kind of created a filler, as it were, while he was typing, and figured that would be an appropriate one. And he said basically the same thing, that it's really hard that we can't actually speak. And since the sun is down, I'm just going to say this: there are a lot of plans and there are a lot of intentions to create some new things within this ministry that are going to create a greater level of fundraising, a greater level of leadership responsibility, and very specifically to, move into a higher level of amount of people who will be able to come in and be in the Midrash with us. Eventually, we will return to our teaching format as a facility becomes available. But I just want to say thank you so much for you guys' patience during this transition. And if you feel like it is appropriate for you to provide funds for some of this transition, and you aren't necessarily in the Slack network, there's 92 subscribers on YouTube, and they have no way to really contact me and get the link to PayPal or our Venmo account. But I just want to say that, if you are in a position where you want to help out, I will make sure to figure out a way to make that possible. Perhaps maybe we'll go ahead and start a Patreon page. I don't know. Anyways, I say all that to say this: do not go away. Stay here. It is only going to get better. And I'm telling you right now, Exodus Shemot is one of the most amazing books that you could study concerning your identity with Yahweh. Genesis, I will tell you right now, Genesis is hands down my favorite. I will never deviate from that. My my heart lies in Genesis. But Shemot gives us the power to understand the ramifications of identity, the ramifications of fear, the ramifications of disconnect, the ramifications of being outside the tent for the wrong reasons. All of that is present in Shemot. Um, and so I'm looking forward to these parashas. As soon as possible, I will get not only will I get into the focus of a video changer so that I can share verses again, but also we will look at bringing people on stage as soon as we either arrive at that 500 subscriber or we find another platform that will allow us to bring people on stage. Because I'm not beyond not using YouTube for that purpose. At any rate. Okay. Whoa. Do you want me to share that, Yehoshua? 7 people here. You should still be present. Yeah, that's heavy. Yeah, if you want me to share that, Yehoshua, I'm not going to do it without your permission, but man, that's an amazing thing right there. That's an amazing thing. Okay, so we're going to probably go ahead and end here because, but if later on, I find that he wants me to share that, I'll make a short or something and squeeze it in behind the back of this video or something. Anyways, thank you for your energy, your prayers, and whatnot as we go through this transition. Thank you so much for your participation. I love you guys, and Shavua Tov.